Hello and welcome to another session of GMAT Verbal Live classes. And this is one of the introductory classes of GMAT Verbal section. So let's get started with what we are going to cover in this class. All right, so let's begin with a description of the verbal section of GMAT. Recently, GMAT has undergone a few changes in terms of its structure, the number of questions that are present, and the kinds of options you get to attempt each section. So basically, earlier versions of GMAT included 41 questions in verbal that had to be done in 75 minutes. But now, because of the changes, there are only 36 questions that have to be attempted in 65 minutes. So that's the major change that has happened. The second is about the verbal section question types. The question types still remain the same. You have three kinds of questions: sentence correction, critical reasoning, and reading comprehension. Approximately 1/3 of the questions are going to be from sentence correction, 1/3 from critical reasoning, and the remaining 1/3 from reading comprehension. In terms of distribution and the timing that you need for each question type, sentence correction is the one where you need least amount of time, and the target time that you should be spending on each sentence correction question should be about 1 to 1.5 minutes. For critical reasoning, on an average, 1.5 minutes is enough. Reading comprehension is tricky because not all passages are of the same type. You may get longer passages that are easier, you may get shorter passages that are tough, or the other way around as well. But still, if you want to know the time that you need to spend, give yourself at least 3 to 4 minutes on just reading the passage, and then probably only 1 minute per question. You don't need more than a minute because you will have read the entire passage quite carefully if you follow the correct strategy, so you will be able to answer the questions in 1 minute. And if you're not able to answer the reading comprehension questions even in 1 minute or 1.5 minutes, in spite of having read the passage, that means it's a difficult question, and spending more time is not going to give you any extra benefits. So you have to make a choice and move on. The next thing about the verbal section is the structure. Just as with the quantitative section of the GMAT, there are a few important things that apply to the verbal section as well. Specifically, how important the first few questions are and the last few questions are. The first few questions, I always recommend students to get at least the first 10 questions correct. And this is something that takes a lot of practice, but that should be your target, because once you have your first 10 questions correct, that means you're already at a good level. So you'll be getting harder questions. All you need to do right now after doing these 10 questions correct is maintain that level. But if you get a few questions wrong in the first 10, that means the kind of questions that you'll be getting throughout the section now it's going to be easy level questions. So that's not going to help you. And usually students don't get the first 10 questions correct in their first practice test. So I would suggest you try getting the first 5 questions correct and eventually increase that to the first 10 questions correct. That's going to help you a lot. And even if it means spending an extra 2 or 3 minutes in the first 10 questions and taking time away from the middle questions, it is still worth it. About the last questions, getting all those last, I would say about 7 questions correct is important, because the level at which you end the GMAT is a very important component of your GMAT score. So the level of questions that you are getting correct towards the end of your verbal section have a huge part to play in the score that you'll be getting for the verbal section. So just like the first few questions, you may not get the 7 last questions correct every time you take a practice test, but you slowly have to build up your accuracy start with getting at least the last 4 questions correct, and eventually build up your accuracy in a way that you will be getting the last 7 questions correct. So these are the two very important parts of the verbal section: getting the first 10 questions correct and getting the last 7 questions correct. The next important point that I want to make about the verbal section is on experimental questions. And usually the first few questions of the verbal section play a very important role in determining your score, as do the last few questions. So this basically means that the experimental questions whose answers do not impact your verbal section score are more likely to lie in the middle. So apart from the first 10 questions and the last 7 questions, the remaining questions in the middle are going to have more of these experimental questions. But you can have 1 or 2 experimental questions in the first few or the last few questions as well. And again, these experimental questions are such that you will not be able to identify which question is an experimental question. You still have to attempt it as if it is scored, but these are not actually scored. And the next very important part is about pacing. Now, I've already told you that in sentence correction, you should target for spending about 1 to 1.5 minutes per question. And so that means if you get about 13 questions of sentence correction, you should be done in about 15 to 17 minutes for those 13 questions. Critical reasoning, that needs more time because you need to read an argument, dissect it properly, and then go through each and every option in detail in a logical manner. So you need more time. Now, this is just an average amount of time. There will be questions that you will be able to do in, let's say, 1 minute. And there might be questions that need more than 2.5 minutes. But if you're spending, let's say, 3 minutes or more than 3 minutes or 4 minutes on a critical reasoning question, that is something wrong. That means either the question is very difficult or you're not able to understand that question. So it's not worth wasting those extra minutes because you have other questions to get to. So just try and put a limit on the number of minutes that you spend on the critical reasoning question. Again, you have about 1/3 of the questions from critical reasoning, but probably a little less. So let's say if you have 12 questions of critical reasoning, you should be spending about, let's say, about 18 to 24 minutes in total on critical reasoning questions. And finally, reading comprehension. So you'll be getting 4 of those passages, and you'll be spending about 3 to 5 minutes on reading and deconstructing and understanding the entire passage, and approximately 1 minute per question for each of these passages. So this is the roughly the amount of time that you should be spending. Now, I know that all these questions are scattered. You will not be getting sentence correction, all questions together, and critical reasoning, all questions together. But timing is very important, and that is what I mean by pacing. So sentence correction, try to get it done within 1.5 minutes. Same for critical reasoning. And basically what pacing means is keeping tabs on how much time you're spending. So the amount of time that you get, 65 minutes, either you can just split it into 2 parts, and you should be done with half the section when the first half time is done, and the second part of the section should be done when the remaining minutes are over. Definitely, you need to finish the section because there is a huge penalty if you're not able to answer all questions within the given time. So if your 65 minutes are up, the best position you have to be in is that you've done all the questions, even if the last question was something like a guess that you had to make because you did not have time to solve it completely. That's okay. But if you're left with a couple of questions that you were not able to answer, that leads to a huge penalty in your score, and that will cause a drop in your verbal score. So this is something that you totally have to avoid. You have to complete this section in any case in these 65 minutes. And then there are a few general strategies that I want to talk about for the verbal section. The first is very important, which is your scratch paper. A lot of students, when they start practicing for their GMAT, when they start preparing for it, don't really believe in the value of the scratch paper. But that is totally wrong, because the scratch paper may not be very useful for solving sentence correction questions, but it is very useful for solving critical reasoning and reading comprehension questions. Why critical reasoning? Because you need to dissect the argument that you get, and then you also need to work out the kind of answers that you're expecting to show up in the options. Same goes for the reading comprehension passages. You need the scratch paper so that you can take notes on what is given in the passage, you can dissect the passage, and then you need to work on the options one by one. So why is it important for sentence correction also? So let's suppose you have a sentence correction, and your question number 4 is a sentence correction. Mentally, if you look at the 5 options that you get, if you mentally cross out or eliminate an option, there's a huge chance that you keep coming back to it, because you get confused whether you canceled that option or you're still considering that option. So that is where the scratch paper helps a lot. All you need to do is write down these options. If you think that option C is definitely not the answer, eliminate that. If you think A and B are definitely not the answers, eliminate that. If you're a little confused about D, that's okay. If you think E is the answer, definitely mark it. And similarly, go to the next question. So your scratch paper should be really organized and should let you know that you eliminate each option completely before you choose the correct answer. So that also gives you a bit of confidence. And this is something that is more of a habit. And you need to build that habit right from when you start practicing and preparing for the GMAT. So it won't come only when you do this in the practice exams, but also when you're doing your rough work, when you're solving questions. Maintain a record of what question you are solving and what is the process that you were following, and that process will be visible through your scratch paper work. For critical reasoning, the scratch paper usually looks like this. So you have an argument, and you dissect the different components of the argument. You have a few questions that you need to answer in that particular question, and then you have these options. So you may do something like this. For example, you may eliminate option B because it was doing the opposite of what you wanted the answer to do. You may eliminate option D because it's doing nothing. You may eliminate option E because it is totally out of scope. So let's say that's the first round that you go through in that question. Now, when you go through that question once again, because you have to select one option out of A and C, your mind will not be confused by the remaining 3 options because you have eliminated them on paper. So there's no chance that these options will confuse you. Now you only have to read options A and C again in detail, and that saves a lot of time. It also gives you confidence in your answers. So that's how the scratch paper work is very relevant for critical reasoning. And coming to reading comprehension, you can't really understand and retain all the important parts of a passage until you put them down on paper. So in reading comprehension, as we'll be discussing in the next few classes, we have to be very organized in mentioning what each paragraph is saying. So let's suppose you are on questions 14, 15, 16, and 17. These 4 questions are based on a particular passage. So your scratch paper usually looks like this. So you have paragraph 1, you note down all the important connections it's making, what kind of conclusions it is giving in that particular passage, what kind of questions it raises. And then you have paragraph 2, you mention what paragraph 2 was saying, and then you have paragraph 3. And now when you look at the questions, question number 14, you have your options here. Let's say question number 14 is a primary purpose question. What is the primary purpose of the passage? Now for primary purpose, you need an overall understanding of the passage, not just one particular portion of the passage. And ideally, if you had a lot of time, you would have read the entire passage again. But you don't have so much time. Time is limited. So what you need to do for these questions, these general questions, is you read your notes once again and very quickly form a general idea of what the passage is trying to say. So let's say this was a primary purpose passage. So you go through your notes and you're able to solve it. Let's suppose question number 15 was based on a very specific part of the passage. For example, why did uh, the authors mention such and such statement? So that's, let's say, question number 15. Now, it's a very specific question. So let's say the answer lies in paragraph number 2. So what you need to do is, you don't have to read the passage that is there on the screen in front of you. You just need to read the notes in front of you for that particular passage. And because you're not reading the passage on the screen, it becomes very, very important that you make these notes. You deconstruct the passage very well when you have the time. Now, another question that usually students have is that I have just 4 minutes or 4 to 5 minutes to read a passage. What do I do? Do I read it or do I make notes? So another thing I would say is that whatever your scratch paper is, it does not have to be in such a neat way that you should be able to read it after the question has been answered. You just need it one time. So don't focus so much on whether you're able to read it afterwards or not. So what basically I want to say is that you need to multitask. With your eyes, you need to read the passage, and with your hands, you need to take down the notes. So that is basically what I do through so much practice. Your hand should be able to just read take down notes, and you should be able to read the passage. So let's get ahead and hello, Divya. Are you able to hear me? Hello, Divya. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right. So let's get to the next slide. All right. So I hope, Priyanka, are you able to hear me? Divya, you're able to hear me, right?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So let's get started with what I'm talking about here, which is review. So this is something that all of you need to do during your practice tests and practice questions. So what usually happens is students feel that they're not getting a question correct, and they do it wrong, they take a lot of time. And once they go to the solutions, they realize that it was actually a very easy question. There was something really simple that they were either missing, or they just did a really silly error. So that's why review is important. That means whenever you get a question wrong, you need to spend time on knowing why you got that wrong. So either it could be something that you didn't know initially, in which case you need to spend more time on knowing the concepts, remembering the concepts. It could be something that you did wrong because you missed something. So these are the kinds of errors that you should not be repeating. And again, it may be something that happened because you did not have time. So this is something that pacing is going to help you with. So just keep a track of the kind of mistakes that you're making, and you should not be making the same mistake twice. For example, in sentence correction, there are actually a handful of rules that you need to remember. And it is only out of these rules that different options will come, that different questions will come. So it's not like it's completely open-ended and any kind of error can happen. That's not the case. So we will be doing the different kinds of sentence correction errors. And as we solve the questions, you'll realize that there's nothing new in the kinds of errors that keep cropping up. It's the same error. It's just that as students, we sometimes miss realizing the kind of error that is there. Again, that is something that you will have to work on. So I highly recommend you to keep a log, or some students, they like to maintain an Excel sheet of the kind of questions they're getting wrong, the mistakes that they're making, and what they learn from each mistake. That is really important. You need to learn from every mistake. From every sentence correction mistake, you will learn a new rule. So that rule is very important. And the more mistakes you make, the more you learn. That means eventually your accuracy will improve. And similarly, if there is something that you missed, and if you keep missing that same point again and again, you will realize that through the review of your mistakes again, and you'll be more aware of it. Because everyone has their own strengths and weaknesses, and there will be your weaknesses as well. You just need to be aware of them. So that is why review is very important. So that was about the introduction of the GMAT and a few more general strategies, but this is the main agenda for today, for this class. So I'm planning to do it in two parts. The first part is focused more on sentence correction, and the second is more focused on critical reasoning. So in sentence correction, punctuation is not a very frequent error. There are just a couple of rules that you need to know, but they're still important because punctuation is something that can easily be missed. It's so small, you may not even realize that there is a punctuation error. And then we will also talk a little bit about meaning and structure. So if you realize, apart from punctuation, meaning and structure, they're not so much involved with grammar. So in sentence correction for GMAT, there are three things that are tested. One is grammar. The second thing is meaning, because there are some sentences that are grammatically correct, they have the correct structure, but they don't really make sense. So those questions, those options are also wrong. And once you are done with the grammar and meaning, the third thing on which you are tested is concision. So you have to be able to express the same idea using least number of words. So the order is always the same: grammar, then meaning, then concision. So if you look at 5 options, you need to first eliminate the wrong options on the basis of some grammar rules. If you're left with a few options that are all grammatically correct, then you look at the meaning. And even then, if you're left with options that are grammatically correct, that mean the same, then you look at concision. It's not in any other order. You have to follow the same order: grammar, and then meaning, and then concision. And many students don't realize this, but meaning and concision do help to solve a lot of questions at the end, especially when you face situations where you're left with 2 options and both look correct. So that is when meaning and concision help you. And looking at the grammar-based errors, there are about 7 errors that you will be tested upon, one of which we are going to cover today. So that is what I call subject-verb agreement. And then there are some other errors like verbs. Verbs is a huge part of GMAT sentence correction. A lot of questions come from verbs, and difficult sentence correction questions usually test verbs. As far as the subject-verb agreement is concerned, these are usually really simple errors that you should be able to identify, but it may take time. Initially, you will not be able to identify that there is a subject-verb agreement error, but these are one of the easiest errors, because as you speak a sentence in your mind, you should be able to realize these errors. And then there are pronouns. So verbs are where the questions can get really tough, and also pronouns. So the tougher questions usually involve these errors. Then there are other errors like parallelism. Parallelism is something that involves really long sentences with lots and lots of phrases. But if you're able to pick out that there is parallelism going on, these are actually pretty easy questions. So these are those questions that look really long and tough, but are actually quite easy. And then there are errors related to comparisons. Again, these are the ones where you get more of the tough questions. And then there are modifiers, which can also get tough. But again, I believe that these are also easier to identify. And finally, the last one is idioms. They are not tested on the GMAT currently so much as they were tested before, like maybe 3-4 years ago, but still you may get a couple of questions on these idioms. Now, another thing that I want to add is that the very easy questions, let's say the 400 level questions, the easiest of them, they usually involve probably one error. So they'll be really super easy to solve. The ones that are about 600 level, they will be using 2 to 3 errors. So you'll be able to eliminate a couple of options based on pronouns and the remaining few options on verbs. But the really tough questions, the ones that are about 700 level and above, they are the ones that use about 2 to 3 errors, as well as they use mistakes in terms of meaning and concision. So you have a lot of things going on in the same question. Each option will be eliminated through a different kind of reason. So that should be kept in mind. If you're getting, if you're doing some practice, try to do practice on the tougher questions, and in those you'll be able to see more than one error. And these sentence correction questions, they usually equally divide these errors. So you'll be getting an equal amount of these errors. Idioms, as I mentioned, maybe just 1 or 2. So there's a very common strategy about sentence correction that we'll be discussing when we begin with the sentence correction. And regarding the critical reasoning arguments, so what we'll be doing today in today's class, we will not be looking at options or solving questions, but we'll be looking more at deconstructing arguments. Because if you're not able to deconstruct the argument correct, there's no chance that you will intentionally get the question correct. Deconstructing the argument is a very important step, and if you don't put enough effort, if you try to do it too quickly, there will be a problem because all options will start confusing you. And that's what usually happens in CR questions. Usually students find that there are 2 options that look correct. And it all boils down to the fact that the argument needs to be deconstructed very well. So let's start with sentence correction. A few important strategies only for sentence correction. The one is about the first option. So I think that since you've given a practice test, you have seen questions of sentence correction, you might know that option A is exactly the same as the original sentence. So you don't need to spend extra time in reading option A again. You have basically 2 big options. Either the sentence is correct according to you or it's not. If it's correct, option A is the answer. All you need to do is find a reason why the other 4 options are wrong. If you're not able to eliminate option, if you're not able to see anything correct, if you think that there is a mistake, you eliminate these options. Okay, is everything fine till now? Any questions?
No, none so far.
Okay. And Priyanka, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, okay. So if you have any questions, just let me know.
Sure.
So that was about option A. And another very, very, very important strategy that will save you a lot of time is that usually they have, let's say this is a sentence and this portion of it is underlined and you have A, B, C, D, E. So option A has exactly something the same. And then you have option B, C, D, and E. There's something called a split in options. And this is something that will save a lot of time. Let's suppose an example that this part, this underlined part of the sentence began with the verb is. So definitely A is starting with is, and let's say B is also starting with is, and C is also starting with is, and D and E, they start with was. Now, in longer sentences, this split that you can see, this 3/2 split, it's difficult to identify, but these splits are always there, and you'll be able to solve a lot of questions based on that. So right now, it's like a decision tree. You just need to decide whether is the correct thing or is the correct part. So let's suppose you decide is absolutely fine. So you eliminate D and E, and there is no need to read the remaining option. All right, is that clear to both
Yep.
of you? Yeah, all right. So these splits usually happen in the beginning of the sentence and at the end of the sentences. In the beginning of the options and at the end of the options, quickly go through, every time you go through those options and see if there is a split. So these are something really important that you'll be able to identify in most of the questions, and they really save a lot of time. So that's the sentence correction strategy basically. And the third one, I already talked about that. So you have to look at grammar first. And if you're still left with a few options that are all grammatically correct, you focus on the meaning. So your options should also make sense, for example, in respect to the time. And finally, they should be concise. So you look at options that are more concise. You don't repeat the same words again and again or the same ideas again and again. So this is something that's really important. And let's get ahead. So this is what I was talking about, grammar, meaning, and concision. So you don't really have to count the number of words, but for example, words like irregardless of. Do you think there's anything wrong in the statement if you begin a sentence with irregardless of? Or do you think it's correct?
It's wordy. It's not required.
Yes, because the ir also means the absence of something, and less also means the absence of something. So you do not need both of these. You just need less, because irregardless is actually a wrong word. So as we do different questions, we'll go through these again and again. And there's no rule, like there's no list of concise versus non-concise elements, but you should be able to identify them as you practice more and more. So after this entire session ends, I will be giving you a few questions, and those questions are divided according to topics. And I suggest you start looking at those questions that are based on concision and meaning specifically. So what's going to happen is initially, for example, in this session, I'm only covering subject-verb agreement, concision, and meaning. So you will find that you will not be able to solve all questions on the basis of only these errors, because there will be some other errors in those questions that we haven't done, but eventually that's going to improve. So let's begin with punctuation and structure. Now, let me start with structure first. One little rule, so these are the rules of sentence correction. If you want to write them down, that's fine, but these are very limited in number, and these are the ones that will be used. Nothing beyond these will be tested in GMAT sentence correction. So in terms of structure, there's one important rule. One is that every sentence should be a complete sentence, and length of the sentence does not matter at all. There will be options where you will find a very long group of words, but it actually does not make a complete sentence. So that is where that option is wrong. The second important rule is, no matter what you choose for the underlined part of the sentence, you always need to read it along with the non-underlined part of the sentence and see if it makes sense. Sometimes the options alone, they make a lot of sense. They are completely fine. They're grammatically correct. But if you try and fit them in the sentence, the final sentence does not make sense, or it's not complete. So that is, again, a check that you have to do before you move on to the next question. Just put your option in that underlined portion and see if it makes sense, if it's correct. So the third rule of sentence correction that we're doing today is concerned with both punctuation and structure. There is only one punctuation that you need to be aware of, which is the semicolon. So the rule over here is there are basically two cases in which these semicolons are used. One is when you have groups of groups. For example, you have 3 activities, A, B, and C, and you have 3 other activities, D, E, and F, and then you have 3 other activities, G, H, and I. When you separate them, you can't just use a comma here and an and here. You need to use a semicolon here and a semicolon here. So this is the rule that you will see a lot when you're dealing with parallelism, and that means that it will come in the longer sentences more. So that is the one case where you use the semicolon. The second is whenever there is a semicolon, you have to check that what lies before a semicolon and after a semicolon need to be complete sentences, not phrases. Basically what a semicolon is, it's a weak period and a stronger comma. And these two cases, A and B, these are mutually exclusive. So either you will have lists of lists or you will have groups of groups. In that case, rule number B does not apply. Or you will simply have one semicolon separating 2 parts of a sentence. And in that case, you just need to ensure that the first part before the semicolon is complete. It's a standalone sentence. And the second part is also complete. And again, this is something that is usually missed by students because it's a very small thing. But I would suggest as soon as you see a sentence very quickly, and it's going to take just a few seconds of your time, just go through the options just to see if there is a semicolon anywhere. And that will just prepare you to be aware of this error. So that's about punctuation and structure. Now let's start with subject-verb agreement. There are, again, a few basic rules that you need to be aware of. So subject-verb agreement is going to involve a few rules. The first is that the subject of a sentence needs to agree with the verb that is being used in that sentence. So let me start with a very easy example. I eat. All right, so that is the subject of the sentence and eat is the verb, and they agree with each other in terms of the number. So this is usually in terms of the number. The subject is plural, the verb needs to be plural. If the subject is singular, the verb needs to be singular. So you can probably add that as one of the other rules of subject-verb agreement, or just put them in the list of other grammar rules. So subject and verb should always agree with each other in terms of their number. Now, obviously in GMAT, you will not get easy sentences like this. What usually happens is they put a subject, S over here, and they put the verb really far away. That means there are lots of words in the middle. And what they do, the test makers, to confuse you as a student is they add a lot of other nouns and pronouns here and there, and lots of other verbs as well, just to confuse you. So what is going to guide you in this case is going to be more about the meaning. So you have to look at the sense that the sentence is trying to make. And we will look at a few options as well once we start looking at the subject-verb agreements in detail. But right now, I'm just giving you an overview of the different kinds of errors that will be there. We will do subject-verb agreement in more detail in a few minutes. So that is what subject-verb agreement is all about. Agreement in terms of subject and the verb. And we'll be doing a few different cases as well. Second is pronouns. So pronouns, as you might already know, are used in place of nouns, I, me, your, and lots of other different kinds of pronouns. So the basic rule, the basic guiding principle of pronoun errors is that the pronoun must match the noun in place of which it is being used. Suppose the noun refers to a certain Mrs. X. The pronoun that is used for that noun must be a female pronoun. That is one easy example. Suppose the noun in this case represents a team of students or a team of players. That means the pronoun that you are using for that team of students will focus more on the team. So you don't look at whether students is plural or singular. You look at this entire noun. This entire noun refers to one team of students. That means the pronoun that you are using for that noun is going to be a singular pronoun. So these are the kinds of errors that will be tested under pronouns. And everything, is it clear so far?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, all right. And when usually students look at these errors in writing, they look like pretty easy. If you go through these list of rules, they're very easy. You remember most of them. But the application is the tough part, and that is something that we have to work on. So the third kind of error, which is tested a lot in the tough questions, is verbs. So in verbs, we will be talking about the tenses. And the most important tense in verbs that you have to be aware of is the perfect tense. So the perfect tense, basically using the H words, has, have, and had. There's a whole lot of errors that revolve around these three verbs. Very, very important. And then there are some exceptions to the normal rules of verbs that are also tested time and again. So that is what we will be covering in verbs. Then there's another group of errors known as modifiers. There are different kinds of modifiers that people use, the kinds of terms. But basically, modifier is related to two important parts of speech. One is an adjective and one is an adverb. So just to recap what is usually done in like school level grammar classes, adjectives are words that describe a noun or a pronoun. And adverbs are those words that describe either an adjective or a verb or another adverb. So this all looks pretty easy, but the usual mistake that students make is not able to identify which of these is being described by which of these modifiers. So I'll give you a very easy example for each one of them. So let's say there is a person, and you say that this is a very smart person. He is a smart person. So smart basically modifies person. Similarly, if you simply say he is smart, so smart is modifying the pronoun he. So that's where adjectives are used. Coming to adverbs, these are trickier. So for example, if you say he is very smart, so very is used as an adverb that modifies the adjective smart. And let's use this on a verb. Let's say if I say, please eat your food quickly. Now, quickly is the adverb that is modifying eat, which is a verb. A very common mistake that you will find in a few options is something like, please eat your food quick. So this is a completely wrong sentence, a wrong structure, because you cannot use an adjective to modify a verb. Again, this might look a little easy right now because these are really simple verbs and adjectives, but if you add more and more stuff between them and before them and after them, it becomes really complicated. So just remember this little rule that adverbs are the verbs that are the words that usually end with ly. And there are some other adverbs like very or even quiet. So just remember, you cannot use these to modify nouns and pronouns. These have to be used for adjectives, verbs, or other adverbs. Another easy case, another easy example that we often use in real life is when we ask someone, how are you doing? They usually say, I'm doing good. So tell me, do you think this is correct? This phrase over here, doing good?
No.
So doing is a verb. All right, what is good? What part of speech? Is it an adjective or an adverb?
An adverb.
No, good is going to
Sorry,
be,
an adjective, yeah.
yeah, it's an adjective. So do you think this adjective can describe the verb?
No.
It won't, because adjectives describe only nouns and pronouns. You cannot use good for any action. So what you're going to say is, I'm doing well. All right, so well is the adverb form of good. Well is one of the rare cases where you don't have ly at the end of an adverb, but most of the adverbs will have ly. Again, you'll be able to notice these differences when you look at the split between the options. You might have a few options that are adjectives and a few options that simply add the ly after the adjective to make it an adverb. So that is where you have to go to that particular part of the option and eliminate or choose the options. And another general thing about sentence correction that I'm going to add here is that you don't have to always read each and every option in detail to solve the questions. Once you realize that there is an error, all you need to do is you look at every other option that has the same error. So you basically have to see, you don't have to read each option, just see if there is an error, and you simply eliminate that option even without reading it. Right? So that is something that you can only do in sentence correction, because in critical reasoning and reading comprehension, you have to read each option in detail. So that is what we will be discussing when we come to modifiers. This is parallelism, which is one of the easiest errors to identify, but it also takes a lot of time because you have really long sentences. So I'll give you a very easy example of what parallelism is. For example, I just say that I am eating, let's say, reading, and thinking. What happens in this kind of sentence is you have three actions that are going on. You just need to take care of one thing. All three of them, if they are verbs, they have to be in the same tense. So either you can say, I am eating, reading, and thinking. You can also say, I am eating, am reading, and am thinking. Again, the longer sentences will have a similar structure. So if you have verbs that are part of a list, you just have to make sure that they are in same tense. And if your list does not consist of verbs, but groups of other words, you just have to make sure that they are the same part of speech. So by part of speech, I mean they're all either nouns, or they're all adjectives, or they're all adverbs. They have to be same. You can't have combinations of verbs and adjectives and nouns. So these are really easy sentences right now, but how things get complicated is that there will be a lot of stuff added over here, a lot of words added over here, and a lot of words added over here. But the basic sentence is still the same. I'm eating, reading, and thinking. Okay, so you'll be able to identify that this is a parallelism question, a parallelism sentence based on the groups of words that you will have. And of course, the rule about semicolons also applies here. So if you have three groups of groups, so let's say you have three items here, A, B, C, you have three items here, D, E, F, and you have three items here. You have to make sure that all 9 of them are either in the same tense or they are the same part of speech, and they need to be separated by semicolons. And finally, you put a semicolon and an and. So that is parallelism, and we will be doing this error again in detail. I'm just going through them in short because you will be solving a few subject-verb agreement sentences, And you might come across these errors in those sentences as well. The next error type is based on comparison. So one little rule that I'll tell you right now about comparison is when you give examples in a sentence, you always either use e.g. or you use such as. If you are using the word like to give an example, that is completely wrong. This is something that we do in our spoken English. We use like to give examples. So that is completely wrong in GMAT sentence correction. For examples, you have to use such as. This abbreviation over here, e.g. is not really used in GMAT, so you can leave this out as well. So basically the rule is that for examples, use such as. If you're using a comparison, if you're comparing two things, then you can use like if you're trying to show similarity. And there are a few other idioms that are used for comparison. For example, as. So in that case, if you're using as once to make a comparison, you have to use the second as again. So that's one of the other smaller rules. So that is comparison. Any doubt or any question so far? If you have any example in mind.
No, nothing from my side.
Okay, all right. And finally is idioms. So that's the last kind of error tested the least. So idioms basically involve errors like not only and but also. This is a very famous idiom that is tested in GMAT. So what you need to remember is if you are using not only in a sentence, 100% of the times you have to use but also. The second important thing that you have to remember about this idiom is whatever comes after not only must be parallel to what comes after but also. Okay, for example, I say, I am not only reading, but I'm also thinking. Okay, so this is a question for both of you. Do you think it's a correct sentence or a wrong one?
I think it's wrong.
Okay, why do you think it's wrong?
It should be I'm not only reading but also thinking.
Yes, because so these are the phrases not only and but also. What comes after but also and what comes after not only have to be parallel, but at the same time, if you consider this am, it's a misfit. Either you use am as common, just like in maths, you use something like this. Either you use it this way, common for all of these phrases over here, or you have to use them for each one. So if you say, I not only am reading, but am also thinking, that would have been correct. But right now, you just need to remove the am and choose the option that does not use the second am. So that's one of the easier idioms and also used a lot. I think you will probably find at least one sentence in the real GMAT that will use this idiom because it's so common. And it's usually used in really long sentences, so it's also very difficult to get it correct. So let's come back to the details about these errors. So we've already talked about punctuation, meaning, and structure. So the two rules about semicolon, I'll repeat them once again over here. When you have lists of lists, you need a semicolon between them because a comma just won't suffice. So you need something stronger than a comma. And the second important rule that you need to remember for a semicolon is that what comes before a semicolon and what comes after a semicolon needs to be a complete sentence. Right, so let's go ahead and look at this question. I don't want you to solve it right now, but let us do this solution together. So as soon as you see this sentence, it looks a really long sentence, so it looks like you'll probably use a lot of time. But the first thing that you need to do is, obviously, don't look at the options. First, read the sentence. So let's read it. To estimate the expansion rate of the universe is a notoriously difficult problem because there is a lack of a single yardstick that all distances can be measured by. Now let's have a look at these options. Option A, you don't have to read again because it's the same. So you can't really see a strong split in these options in the beginning, because you have to estimate or estimating, because there is a notoriously difficult, it is a notoriously difficult problem. And similarly, at the end, also you cannot see a very strong split. Can be measured by, can be measured, difficult problem, can be measured, be measured. So that means there's no other choice, but you have to read each and every option, and that gives you a sign that it is a difficult question. So let's go through these options one by one. And I've already given you a hint that these errors are going to be based on punctuation, meaning, and structure. So what do you think about option A? Do you think it's correct? What is your first feeling about option A regarding the meaning and the structure?
I think it's more of a passive tone.
Okay. All right. All right, let's write
yeah.
that down. Go ahead. Anything else?
Yeah, and the ending of the sentence is not correct. Like measured by, it could have been more better,
Okay.
as mentioned in the other options.
Okay, so do you think it could have been shorter?
Yes, it could have been more concise.
Okay. So it's basically just using words here and there, making it more confusing than it should be. All right, let's come to option B now. So this is something that you'll be doing on your scratch paper work. So you have these options A, B, C, D, E. All you need to put in front of A is it's passive and it's wordy. And we still don't have something strong enough that we can completely eliminate A. So let's go to B. What do you think about B?
To me, it sounds okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Priyanka, what about you?
I think it doesn't look correct because it's being interchanged.
Okay.
Instead of saying because of, it just brings the estimating. And
All
then
Okay. All right. Let's move to option C then. What do you think about option C?
I think it looks correct.
Now remember, all of these 5 options more or less are grammatically correct. So you just have to look at punctuation, meaning, and structure. Just make sure that all of these options that you're still keeping are all complete sentences and the structure is making sense. Do you think there's anything wrong in that regard with C? Anything wrong with C?
From my perspective, it's just that there's 3 words which is before comma, because there's a lack of single yardstick to measure all distances by, and
Okay.
like,
So you think
it is not defining distance between what.
okay.
Yeah.
All right. And what about D?
It's a bit lengthy and because a single yardstick is lacking by which all distances.
Yes, so this is unusually, like, it does not need to be so long. So something that I could say is that D is definitely not the answer because there are better options available. What about E? Do you think we need this part? Or is it just adding extra words that we don't need?
Yeah, it's too wordy.
Yes, so there are better options again. And so let's also eliminate E. Now remember, D and E, grammatically, they are both correct. It's only about their meaning, their structure, because you can say the same thing in less number of words. And while reading through these options, did you realize that there was some kind of split here? If you see, few options use lack of. Option B uses no single yardstick. C again uses is a lack of. And D is anyways using is lacking by. E is using no single yardstick. Now we've already eliminated D and E, so we won't read them once again, but let's look at A, B, and C. If you had to make a choice, which one will you make and why?
C.
Okay, and B, both of you B?
I'll go with B, yes.
B, okay, yes. So B is the correct answer, but we also need concrete reasons why A and C are wrong. So A is wrong. So there's this little rule that you can remember. It's not always correct, but you try and not start the sentence with a to. And always try and not end the sentence with any preposition. This rule about not ending the sentence with a preposition should be used in 100% of the cases. Now remember, all these rules that we are doing, you have to use them when you're writing the essay in the essay section also. So these are basically some tips that you can use for your essay as well. Never end any sentence with a preposition. So prepositions would be words like to, from, by, until, unto, these kinds of words. So that is a strong reason why A option is wrong. And C is wrong because, as you already said, all distances by. This is not correct. You cannot use all distances by because you need to mention what kind of distance. It's between which two things. So that is why all distances by is wrong. And yeah, so that would be the error in C, and B is the correct answer. So just let me know if you are like comfortable with all of the other 4 options, why they were eliminated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you're jotting down a few of these rules, just add one more to the list, which is that avoid options that begin with because. About 99% of the times, because is wrong as the first word of a sentence. So there are 3 important rules that you need to remember from this particular question. Try not to start a sentence with to, try not to start a sentence with because, and definitely do not end a sentence with a preposition. So these are few rules that are not put under a particular category. You just need to like mention them somewhere. Just keep a record of these little rules. So let's move on and try one more question on punctuation, meaning, and structure. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to go through these options, and all right, we'll go through these options after, let's say, about 2 minutes. And remember, don't worry about the time right now. Just focus on getting the wrong options wrong and having a reason for them being wrong. Okay, do you have an answer or at least options that you think are definitely wrong? What do you think about A?
Incorrect.
Do you think it's wrong?
Yeah.
Okay, why do you think it's wrong?
Spending is slowed sharply.
Okay, so grammatically, it's fine, but it's wrong because it does not make sense, right? We're talking about the past here, and this is talking about the present, so it does not make sense. That's why A is wrong. Okay, that's correct. Any other option that you think is wrong?
I think C is wrong.
Because?
Because before the underlying portion start, it says, but that while businesses were expanding means something was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And with that event happening, something else was also happening. And after the comma, C option says some unsold goods had piled up already.
Yes.
And comparatively to C, I think B option is much better.
Okay, so that is good. That is actually one of the examples of a parallelism issue. That's good that you've picked this up. So definitely the verb tenses, they don't match. And apart from grammar, it's also meaning issue because had piled up will mean something different from were piling up. Okay, what about option D?
I think it's incorrect.
Okay, and why do you think it's incorrect?
It's with the piling up of unsold goods.
Okay, yes. And also, if you look at this sentence, another thing is this clearly has a split. You either start the options with unsold goods or you start with consumer spending. So you're talking about businesses expanding production. It makes more sense to begin with unsold goods were piling up, right? So C is definitely wrong. A is wrong. Can you find, so you said D is wrong because of piling up of unsold goods on store shelves. That's definitely wordy, using too many words, and also using this extra word with, which we don't really need. What about E? Anything wrong in E?
Well, like you mentioned before, it makes more sense for unsold goods to come first. And also, I guess the tense agreement with consumer spending has slowed sharply, but
Yes.
businesses were expanding this.
So there are definitely more than one error In this, you've got has slowed, which does not make sense with the were expanding, and the with is again wrong over here. So B is the correct answer. And there's one little thing that I want to add here is that in this kind of sentence, now this does not apply to all sentences, but in this sentence, beyond the first time that you read it, you don't really need to read this part of the sentence again and again. Your actual sentence that you need to read is basically from here. While businesses were expanding their production, unsold goods were piling up on store shelves as consumer spending slowed sharply. Okay, so that is one thing that usually you can do in most of those sentences. You can try and shorten them down and remove the extra part. Just stop reading those extra portions that are not adding. Another thing that I want to highlight is sharp slowing. Now, sharp is an adjective. Do you think this group, a sharp slowing, it's correct or is it wrong? Just remember those rules about the adjective and the adverb that we just did.
It's wrong. It could have been better if it would have been slowed sharply or sharply slowed.
Okay. So definitely if you say sharply slowed, that phrase is correct. One thing that is usually used to trick students is now slowing. If you pay really less time to it, slowing is a verb. But do you think in this case it's used as a verb in this particular sentence? Only in this option.
No.
It's not being used as a verb here. It's being used as a noun. So grammatically, it's correct. Sharp slowing. In the other cases, the sentence is using slowing and slowed as verbs. So again, you have to be very careful. Usually you will find these different variations, like simply the word cutting. Cutting, what comes to our mind is it's a verb, but it can also be used as a noun. So you have to be aware that all of these variations can be used in different ways. Okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So let's try another question on punctuation, meaning, and structure. So again, 2 minutes. Okay. What do you think about option A?
It doesn't seem parallel because it's not like it should be not only but also.
Okay. So that's good. So what comes after not only needs to match with what comes after, but also it's not matching in option A. What about B?
Using and, but it's comparing, so it should use but instead of and.
Okay. All right. And what about C then?
Same.
Same thing, not only but also doesn't go together. It ends with end.
Uh, Not only an examination of this, and okay. What about D?
A bit wordy also.
Okay. The difficulty with reconciling reason, it's wrong. It's usually difficulty of doing something. So the with does not make sense here. And you don't really need together over here. It's one extra word because you already have the and, so that's taking away the concision. Okay, and so yes, the answer is going to be E. Not only examination of the difficulty, this, and this, but also an exploration of. All right. So right now it took us together about 3 minutes to solve this question. But I would say this kind of question in the real test should be, it can be solved in 1 minute. Okay. All right. So let's move on to one more question. Okay. Are you able to see the question, all of you?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to give you 1.5 minutes for this question.
Actually, I'm not able to view the full option A and B because of the side video popping up.
Okay, let me.
Yeah, if you can.
Okay, that's okay.
Julia, you can minimize it. That's what I did. If you just look, like there's a minus option.
Okay, one little clue that I'm going to add here is it's actually a simple one. Whenever you use the comparative form of any word like more or better, you have to use than with it. There could be a lot of words between them, but you have to use a than. So just remember this little rule. Okay, any thoughts about option A?
Same thing which you mentioned. There is no then, as more is mentioned. Yeah.
So once you realize that, is there any other option that repeats the same error?
I think B and E.
Yes. So what your process should be in the test is, once you realize that this is the error in A, without reading the options in detail, just quickly go to the end of every option and see if they even have a than.
Yeah.
Since they don't have it, just eliminate A, B, and E quickly without reading them. Now, okay, out of C and D.
C is a better option.
Okay, so what's the problem with D?
It's more wordy comparatively to D. C is more concise and gives the complete meaning.
Yes. So just add one more little rule to the list of rules that you should try and not use the word it to talk about an entire phrase. Remember, it is a pronoun and it should only be used for another noun. Now in option D, this word it is being used for this entire option, which is wrong. So that's another reason to eliminate option D. Just remember, whenever you have it needs to refer to a noun. And same goes for the pronoun this. So whenever you see these words, these pronouns, they must always refer to a noun. And yes, C is the correct option. Okay, let's try one more question before going to subject-verb agreement.
Okay, is it only me who can see this on the right side of the screen, or are you guys also seeing it?
I think I minimized it from my end. There might be a few options at the top of that chat window.
Okay, I'll try.
You can just look at the minus bar. There's like a blue minus bar. You can just click on it.
Yeah, on the extreme left.
Thanks, that worked.
Okay.
Chú là cái ghê kìa. Chú là cái ghê kìa sao đây apa? Chú
Okay, were you able to identify a punctuation issue in any of these options?
Yeah, the semicolon.
Yeah. So do you think it's being used correctly in these options B and D and E?
No. Well, in B,
No.
definitely not.
Okay, so what happens in B is what comes after the semicolon is not a complete sentence. That's gone. In D, the second part is correct. Is the first part a complete sentence?
No. Well,
Yeah, that's a complete sentence. Okay, what do you think about option A?
After the comma, it says allowing the exploration. Allowing the exploration to whom? Is it to computers or mathematicians? So that is not clear.
Okay, yes. So that is a modifier error because it's creating confusion about the verb allowing. Okay. And all right, so A is gone. There's another reason why A is wrong, which I'll talk about later. Out of C, D, and E, anything that you find wrong?
would C be like allowing them? Would then
Allowing them to explore. Them, them seems fine. What do you think about this? Is it really clear what is the noun that this is referring to?
no.
No, it's not clear. So because of that, this D is also gone. So make a choice between C and E.
I'll go with C.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Priyanka?
Same.
Yeah, it's going to be C because of, again, this. Now, the extra thing that I was talking about in option A is it's about the meaning. See, this is talking about are too time consuming or involve too many variables, whereas C is talking about would. So would is a little confusing tense. Would, I'll give you a little detail. Would is used when you are talking about the past. Oh, sorry, not about the past, about the future. And in this case, we are talking about taking too much time, using too many variables to test manually. So this is about the future, cases that will be solved in the future, not right now. And that is why C is the better option, because you're talking about using computers to test cases that in the future would take too much time or use too many variables to test manually. And again, them is correct because them talks about the mathematicians, and it's quite clear they are the ones who have to explore the issues. So C just makes perfect sense in all ways. When we discuss the verb-based errors in detail, we'll come to would once again. But this is just a slight grammar rule that you need to be aware of, and it's used a lot of times. So let me skip this question because we don't have a lot of time. So let's begin with a few errors based on agreement. So I've already talked about this, that there must be an agreement between the noun and the verb. We've always also seen that at a number of options and in a number of questions. But the problem comes when there are lots of different nouns and lots of different verbs. So just remember the noun and the verb must match each other in terms of meaning as well, not just number. So for that, you need to see if it makes sense. So meaning and number. And then you have the case where you have a noun and you have a pronoun and you have a verb. So in that case, all three of them should match with each other. The pronoun that you're using must match the noun. and the verb that you're using must match that particular pronoun. So that's the basic rule for agreement. Now coming to the verb and subject agreement, these are a few of the very important rules that you need to remember. Now usually, the first rule talks about verb. Usually what happens is, with a pronoun which is singular, for example, I, the verb that goes is was. I was doing something, or he was doing something. But what happens when you have hypothetical situations? In that case, you have to use the verb regardless of the kind of noun or the pronoun you have. For example, if I were a friend, I would have done this. So in this case, I am using verb for the I, which is singular, but only because it's a hypothetical situation. So to find out if it's hypothetical or real, again, you have to look at the meaning of the sentence. And that's going to tell you if you have to use the were or you have to use the was. And how do you know whether this is being tested or not? You look at all the options and you see if a few options are using were and the few other options are using was. So that's one important rule. The second is whenever you have these words, together with, along with, in addition to, as well as. All of these phrases, they are not equal to and. So let's say I have a sentence, he, together with his friends. So this does not equal he and his friends. So whenever you have these phrases, together with, along with, in addition to, or as well as, don't focus on these words. Focus on what comes before that. So whatever verb comes here needs to agree with the he, not with his friends. So he, together with his friends, is coming over. Or he, in addition to his friends, is coming over. All right, is this rule completely fine? Did you understand it?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. The next thing is adding a number of nouns before the verb does not change anything. So this we will look at when we talk about longer options, when you have, for example, a noun here and you have a host of other nouns in between. So you don't have to lose sight of what is the verb and it makes sense with which noun. And that noun and that verb should make sense with each other. They should agree with each other. The other nouns don't really matter. The fourth rule is about collective nouns. And there is no single rule for collective nouns, but you just have to remember, again, it's about meaning. So if you talk about a team of players, if they are doing something collectively, the team of players has won because they've done something collectively. But if they're doing something separately, let's say the team of players have gone to their rooms. That means they're going to their own respective rooms. In that case, we are going to treat it as a plural noun. So again, it depends on the meaning. If they're doing everything together as one group, it'll be singular. If they're doing separate things, it will be treated as a plural noun. The next rule, the fifth one, is about either, neither, each, and none. Whenever you have a sentence or a noun group that starts with either of, or neither of, or each of, or none of, for example, either of the students, this will always be treated as singular. Each of the students, none of the students, neither of the students, either of the students, always singular. There's nothing about meaning in this case. And the last one is when you have these groups, neither this nor that. So this could be confusing because let's say you have neither he nor his friends blank invited. Now, in this case, there could be confusion. Are you going to look at he or are you going to look at his friends? So just remember this basic rule, look at whatever comes second. So don't worry about the he, just worry about the friends. So neither he nor his friends were invited. So that's the basic rule. All right. So any doubt in any of these rules of subject-verb agreement? Any question?
No, none from me.
No? All right. So let's try this question. Let's try this question together. So let me read this. After massive military preparations for this operation, you don't need to know the name, the powers were poised to conquer the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, but their defeat at this battle in December of that year, and then you have these options. So basically, the verb with which these options are starting is one or the other form of the word reveals. So this verb is being used for which thing? Which noun? Is it being used for preparations or the operation, powers, Soviet Union, summer, defeat, battle, or December? What do you think it's referring to?
Defeat.
Yes. So we are talking about defeat. So the defeat reveals that. What do you think about option A now, if you read the full option? Okay, one little rule that I'm adding here, it's not related to subject-verb agreement, but it will help you solve this question, is the difference between will and would. You see there's a split, 2 options with will, 3 with would. Now what you need to do in this case, what you need to remember is that when you are talking in the present, and this is a little tricky one to understand, when you are talking in the present about the future, for that future, you are going to use the word will. For example, I believe that I will take the GMAT test. But when you are talking in the past, again, about the future, it does not matter whether that future has come or not. But when in the past you were talking about the future, then you have to use the word would. For example, I believed last year that I would take the GMAT test. Okay, is this distinction clear to all of you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So use this new information to see whether option A is correct or not.
Incorrect because it's will.
They're talking about the future, but from the past perspective. So this past and the will, they don't match. So that's why option A is wrong. Go through all these options and see if you can eliminate any other option on the same basis.
Is it C?
C will be eliminated because again, had, imagined, and will, they don't match. Okay, let's talk about, another of these splits. So you have one option with reveals now and two options with revealed. Which one do you think makes more sense? Do you think all of this is happening now, or it all happened in the past?
It all happened in the past.
Yes. So again, because of meaning and not because of the grammar, option B is also eliminated because of reveals. All right, now make a choice between D and E.
I think E is correct.
Okay, why do you think D is wrong?
It's unnecessarily wordy towards the end of the sentence.
Soviet Union's vast territory.
And it talks about Soviet Unions. It doesn't talk about Soviet Union.
Yes,
That apostrophe, yeah.
yes, that's correct. So you don't really need all of these extra words. Vast Soviet territories would do just fine because it's not changing the meaning of the sentence. So that means you can use less number of words. So E is definitely going to be the answer. So concision, you remember you reach to concision only when you're sure that the grammar and the meaning are correct. So you don't go to concision first before going to grammar and meaning. So let's solve another question on subject-verb agreement. I think this one is going to be a little easier, so I'm going to give you less time for this. Okay.
Okay, I'm done.
Okay, what do you think about option A?
It's redundant. It's using every year and it's also using annually.
Okay, that's a good observation. So because of this, option A is wrong. And I think also option D is wrong because of the same reason, once every year. All right, so any subject-verb agreement in option B?
Yeah, the reaches because it's fruit.
Yes, so reaches is wrong. It should be reach. And in all of these cases, the word such as is being used for example, which is correct. If they would have used like, that would have been wrong. Okay, out of C and E, which one do you think it's correct?
E.
E, yes. Because C is again making the same mistake. Reaches ripeness only once. And it's using reaches for this, this, and this. All right. So one little extra rule that I'm reminded of over here, but it's not being used in this sentence, is that, again, 99% of the times, don't start any sentence with the word being. Just like you don't start sentences, try to avoid starting sentences with because. In the same way, avoid sentences that begin with being. So that's just one of the extra rules. So E is the answer. Let's move ahead and try this question now. And remember, this one has a very clear split. Okay, any option you would like to eliminate? Or rather, groups of options. Would you eliminate were wound or was wound? Were, yes. Because remember, this is a little twisted kind of a sentence where the verb comes before the noun it refers to. And don't focus on the arts. Arts is not the main noun, it's the cluster of arts. And it's a collective noun and it's being used as one entire object. So it's singular and you cannot use were. So A is gone, B is gone. All right, after this elimination, which one would you choose as the answer and why?
For me, it was D,
D, okay, why not C?
which was spreading seems incorrect.
Yes. So out of C and D, definitely you eliminate C because C is wordy. You usually try and avoid the verbs with the ing form. If you have a choice, just eliminate these options. Now, out of D and E, remember that spread over here is being used as a verb. Over here, it's used more like a proposition, spread far and wide. So out of D and E, okay, Priyanka, you've chosen D. Divya, what about you? D or E?
Yeah, I'll go with D.
Yes, D is correct. So one extra rule that I want to tell here is about which and that. So the basic rule is that you never use a comma before a that. This comma over here is the reason why E option is wrong. It's another reason why E option is wrong. You never use comma before that, but you always use the comma before which. And one more rule is that which always refers to the noun or the noun group before it, immediately before it. So which is always going to refer to this cluster of arts. It's not going to refer to any other noun. And which is, again, one of the very commonly tested errors in GMAT. So you have to be very careful whenever you see a comma and a which in any option. So that is option D, which is the answer. Let's solve one last question on subject-verb agreement before we look at critical reasoning. Okay, here is last question. Okay, did anyone get an answer?
Yeah, I have.
Okay, let's start with option A then. What do you think about A? Is it wrong?
I think it's right.
Okay, you think it's right.
Yeah.
And did you check the semicolon? Before and after the semicolon, you have sentences complete?
Yes.
Yes. All right, let's keep A.
I thought, well, I thought it was right, but then I compared it to E,
Okay.
and it's not like comparing how it was before. That's what I found, but I'm not sure if it's right.
Okay. All right. And what about B?
It talks about 5 times more than. I think greater than is a much better choice than more than. 5 times more than. That's why I eliminated B.
So B is eliminated more because of the meaning, the sense that it's not making. So B is gone. And I think you should have observed these pronouns there and they and they and they again. So we are talking about obviously a lot of birds, but we are using just one name to identify with all the birds, and that's why it has to be singular throughout the sentence. So C, D, and E are wrong, and A is the answer. Okay. Now just remember that all the rules that we've done with subject-verb agreement are the only rules that you need to know if you get an error of that kind. So that's all that we'll be doing in sentence correction for today's class. We'll be doing a little bit of CR after this. But all the questions that you will solve, I'll give you a list of questions topic-wise after the class. And you don't need any other rule beyond what you've learned so far if you have a subject-verb agreement error. And the same goes for all the other question types, the error types. So basically, all it comes down to this is usually students either do not observe the kind of error that is there, they either miss it, or they just make a silly mistake because they did not have time. So these are the only two reasons why you'll be getting the questions wrong. So be very, very aware of these loopholes. All right, so before we move on to critical reasoning, do you have any question about what we've done so far? Any doubt or question?
Nothing from me.
No? And Priyanka, any question or doubt?
No, all good.
All right. And let's go ahead to critical reasoning. Just let me know if you need a short break of a couple of minutes. Do you need one?
I'm good.
Good? All right.
Yeah, I'm good too.
All right. So let's start with critical reasoning. So this is a problem area for a lot of students because sometimes they keep practicing, but they still don't improve in their accuracy. So critical reasoning is a lot about understanding what the argument is trying to say. Sometimes you can have arguments that use the perspective of only one person. Sometimes you have arguments that talk about two different perspectives. It's very, very important to be very clear of what is actually being mentioned in the argument. So I'll start with a few common critical reasoning strategies. The first strategy is the order in which you approach a CR question. So what you have in a CR question is you have an argument, which is a small passage that you have a question, and you have the 5 options. Well, today we won't be solving any questions. We'll be looking more at the structure of arguments. So this little strategy will not apply today. But otherwise, when you solve questions, the first thing that you need to read is not the argument, but the question. Because there are, let's say, 10 or 12 different things that you can get from an argument. You don't have to waste time on all of them when you're reading it. You need to know what you are being asked in the question, and then you approach the argument from that perspective. So there are a few common question types. You either get questions on the assumptions that are being made in that particular argument, and very closely related to assumptions is another question type called weakening. So how do you weaken the argument? Basically, how do you weaken the argument is you look at the assumptions and you attack them or you reverse them. So these are related to each other. And then you have another question type, which is strengthening the argument, which is again related to assumptions, because what you need to do in those questions is again look at the assumptions and just strengthen them by providing extra evidence through the options. And then there are a few other question types, like how do you evaluate the argument? So basically, which of these following options is going to help evaluate the argument? Is it going to strengthen the argument? Is it going to weaken the argument? And sometimes there are arguments that have a paradox. And what you need to do in that question is you need to solve the paradox using the options. Then there is a very rare question type. Maybe you'll get just one of those, which is completing the argument. So the last sentence is incomplete, and you just need to choose from the options. Another question type is boldface, where two parts, two portions of that entire argument will be written in boldface, and you need to identify what part they are playing, what role they are playing. So these are the most common types. But out of these, assumptions, weakening, and strengthening, these three, they form about 50%, not 50%, I would say 80% of all CR questions. And within them, weakening and assumptions are the most important. So I remember going through the recording of the quantitative section, the class that happened yesterday, and one of the questions that the student asked was that, is there a question type that we can focus less on? So I would say for CR, that question type exists, and that is these few questions, because you will get probably one or maximum two of these, but half of your questions are going to be on assumptions and weakening. So in any case, you cannot make these two question types your weakness. You have to be really strong in knowing these two kinds of questions. So that should be the focus of your CR practice. The other questions will simply come and go. So for these three question types, the main ones, assumption, weakening, and strengthening, what is most important is deconstructing the argument, which is the focus of today's class. So that is your first strategy. How do you pace yourself? What do you need to do first when you look at an argument? The second thing is the time. I already mentioned that once, but you have to spend at least 1 minute in doing a complete CR question, including deconstructing the argument, looking at the question, and looking at the options. And a maximum of 3 minutes. That means your average should be about 1.5 minutes per question. And the third thing is, again, your scratch paper work. You have to maintain that in more detail for the CR questions as compared to sentence correction. So your scratch paper work will consist of two important parts. One is what's happening in your argument, and one is your options. So let's see what actually happens in an argument. Now, this is really important stuff. Every argument that you get is going to have three important parts. And that's the first job that you do whenever you read the argument after reading the question stem. You first identify what is the conclusion. Sometimes it is very easily observable. You will find words like thus and hence and therefore. Sometimes it's not so explicitly stated. But you need to know, what is the argument trying to say? Why is it writing so much? What does it want you to believe in? So that's the conclusion. Apart from the conclusion, all the evidence that it gives, that we simply call the premise or the premises. And remember, all of this components of an argument part, it also applies to your essay. So in the AWA section, the analytical writing assessment, also you have to analyze an argument. So the same steps, the same components go into that argument itself. There's a conclusion, there's evidence. In the essay argument, you will have more of the premises, you will have like 3 or 4 different kinds of evidence. But in the verbal section, you will probably have just 1 or 2 kinds of evidence. So these two are the things that are directly given, explicitly stated in words. Then there's another third thing that basically acts as a bridge between them, which is the assumptions. So assumptions are never stated. You have to figure them out. And it's not like anything can be an assumption. There are a few important rules. One is that the assumption, it must be true for the argument to exist. So let's say you have a particular thought A in mind. When you're reading that argument, you have the conclusion, you have the evidence. You think that A is the assumption. So one little test that you have to do is, you have to check, what if A is wrong? Does the argument still stand? If not, that means A is not the assumption. Okay, so let me give an example that will make this more clear, because this is a very, very, very useful point. It helps you to solve the assumption questions, the weaken questions, and the strengthening questions. For example, let's take a simple cause-effect relationship. So let's say in a particular city, in the month of June, the number of tourists increases, and in the same month, the number of crimes that are committed also increases. So the conclusion is, because of the tourists, the crime also increases. So that is the main conclusion, that tourists are the reason why crime is increasing. That's the conclusion. The premises are these pieces of information that are given to you. All right. So in this case, the assumption is, let me give you two options for assumption, and then I want you to figure out whether it's an assumption or not. So let's say one is that gun laws are, let's say, less strict in June, right? Let's say this is the other option. And the second is that if there are no tourists in all the months or in all the years when in June there were no tourists, the crime also did not increase. All right, so those are the two alternatives for an assumption. Which one do you think is correct and which one do you think is wrong?
I think tourist and crime, that assumption is correct.
Okay. And why do you think the other option is wrong, the gun laws one?
Because it is not a must be true, and it does not fall apart the conclusion.
Yes.
If we try to negate it, yeah.
Yeah, so even if you try to negate it, let's say gun laws are more strict in June, it doesn't really impact. So this is the way you solve the assumption questions when you get. So what happens is you'll be able to eliminate a few options because they just don't make sense. And then you're left with two options and you're confused which one is the actual assumption. So there's this test that you can do. You try to negate it and see which option is more important for the conclusion to still hold. And yes, in this case, it is option that bases the tourists and the crime. So is it clear, Priyanka?
Yeah, clear.
Yeah, all right. So the types of questions that you get, I think I've already covered that. So let's skip this slide. Okay, this is really important, the common argument types. So there are a few common patterns that you will see in most of the arguments. So these patterns will help you break down those arguments much faster than if you did not know these patterns. So the first one is cause and effect. What usually happens in these is just like the crime example. So let's take a real life example. Let's say I eat ice cream in the month of December. All right. Let's say on 31st December, I ate an ice cream. And on the same day, 31st of December, I started suffering from cough. So that is the kind of argument that you will get. an event happened, and then another event happened, and so basically the conclusion is that the ice cream is responsible for giving cough to me. So in these kinds of arguments, there are three assumptions that you need to be aware of. The first assumption that I'm making whenever I'm concluding this causal relationship is that there is no other cause. And this is the only cause that leads to cough. So basically I'm saying that I did not do anything else that made me catch the cough. The second is that it's not a coincidence. So basically this means that whenever I will have ice cream on 31st of December, I will always have cough on the same day. The third is that the reverse is not true. Now this assumption is used mainly when those two cause and effect events are happening at the same time. So you're assuming that it's not because of the cough that I decided to eat ice cream. Okay, so these are the assumptions. Now, most probably you will get questions on which of the following is an assumption or which of the following weakens the argument. So how do you weaken an assumption? You attack it. So either you can weaken it by showing that there was another cause, there was something else that you did that led you to suffer from cough, or you show that it's just a coincidence. You eat ice cream every year on the same day, but you only got cough this particular year, which will basically establish that there was another cause. So it's not a coincidence. And the third thing you can do to weaken this kind of argument is that the reverse is actually true. You show that somehow you were suffering from cough already before you ate the ice cream. Okay? Is this clear to all of you?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So remember, as soon as you see that there is a cause and effect pattern happening, just remember these three assumptions. And on the basis of these three assumptions, you'll be able to solve a lot of questions. Obviously, if you get an assumption question, it will be saying which of the following is an assumption. So you will have concrete statements. But if you have a weakening or a strengthening question, you will have a question like which of the following, if true. That means that it's all fictional. So you have to assume that it does not have to be true, but if it's true, does it attack the assumption or not? So that's a very important distinction that you need to be aware of, especially between the assumption and the strengthening question types. So in weaken and strengthening, you all have fictional options. In assumption, you don't have the fictional options. So that's the most common kind of pattern that you get. The next one is plans, especially when we're talking about, let's say, the mayor of a city has decided to do something. So let's say there's a lot of traffic problem in the city. So the mayor is saying that we are going to start a new metro service. So that's all what the argument is saying, that there's a lot of traffic and the mayor says that we need to start a metro service. Now, in this case, the conclusion is not explicit, but you can still make it out that the conclusion is that the mayor thinks this plan is going to solve the problem of traffic. So in these kinds of arguments, there is only one assumption that you need to be aware of. The assumption is that the plan will work. There is no problem, or even if there is a problem, we can solve it really easily. So it looks like a very common sense assumption, and that is why for plan-based arguments, you don't really get questions on what's the assumption. You get questions on weakening and strengthening. So how do you weaken this kind of argument? You attack it, you attack the assumption. Basically, any option that shows that the plan will not work or that there is a problem that has no solution, that option is going to be the answer. So this one is pretty straightforward. All you need to do is find a reason why that plan will not work. So that's plans for you. The third is sampling. Now this is a little bit based on statistics. You don't need numbers for this, but just understand that there's a difference between a sample and the general population. So let's say the argument says that in the city A, a new, let's say a new drug was tested, let's say in a clinical drug trial, and it was effective. Therefore, we must start using this drug all over the country. Now, let me put this question to you. What do you think is the assumption in this case?
It's using a small sample. It's just using city A, and it's extrapolating that for the whole country.
Yes. So what applies to the sample will apply to the entire population. So the best way to weaken such an argument is going to be that you show that the sample does not really represent the entire population. So that one is also straightforward. That's the third kind of argument. The fourth kind of argument is when you're given evidence in terms of percentages and numbers. Now, one little rule, remember, sometimes the argument talks about a lot of stuff, a lot of evidence in terms of percentages, but the options are talking about numbers. Now, that's going to be wrong. That means that option that talks about the number is a wrong option. Similarly, if the argument is talking about numbers and a particular option is talking about percentages, it's again wrong because you can't really compare percentages and numbers. So let me give a fictional argument to you. So in city A, you have two cities, city A and city B. In city A, you have a total of 5,000 doctors. And in city B, you have a total of 3,000 doctors. In city A, when the doctors were giving a test, 200 of those doctors were able to pass the test. In city B, let's say only, let's say 400 of those doctors were able to pass the test. On the basis of this information, I can say that doctors in city B are smarter. Do you think that this is a correct conclusion? What do you think is the assumption in this case? Or what do you think it's wrong? Or do you think, can you even compare doctors being smart?
No.
No, because you don't know the percentage of doctors who passed the test, who even took the test. You just know that this is the total number of doctors. You don't know how many took the test. So you basically cannot really say if they are smart or not. So you just have to be aware of these situations whenever you have numbers and percentages in the argument. Can you even compare those two different cases? So that's what happens in these kinds of arguments. And those were the common kinds of patterns that you get. Very quickly, I'll go through the common wrong options. So although we won't be solving the options today, but still you need to know that any option that uses extreme language, like never or always or definitely, I would say 100% of the times those options are wrong, the ones that are really extreme. Then there are options that do the opposite of what you're intending to do. Let's say it's a weakening question, and the option makes sense because it is doing what the argument is saying, but it's going to be wrong because the question is about weakening and the option is actually strengthening the argument. So any option that does the opposite of what you want it to do is wrong. It looks really easy when it's written like this, but in real life, when you look at the options, you can sometimes get confused. Sometimes it does happen that students misread the question and then they realize that, oh no, I was supposed to choose a weakening option, but I chose a strengthening option. So just be careful about that. Then there's something about out of scope. For example, if the argument is about city X, and there's another option that talks about city Y, it's going to be wrong because it's making an undue comparison. You can't really compare city X and Y until and unless city X and Y are both mentioned in the argument. Similarly, if you're talking about city X in the argument and the option talks about the whole country, again, it's going to be wrong because it's too broad. It's too broad as compared to the argument. Similarly, if the argument is talking about an entire country and the option is talking about only a particular city X, again, it's going to be wrong because it's out of scope. Our scope was originally really broad, but the option is too narrow in scope. So those are a few common wrong options that you will see when you come across these questions. So let's try looking at one argument. And what we're going to do is we're going to dissect it. So this one I'm going to do. I'm just going to show how you can do it more effectively. And there is no question that you need to answer on this. But let's have a look at this argument. What you need to do on your scratch paper is you read the argument and side by side simultaneously make notes in a very structured kind of form, and always use shorthand. You don't need full sentences for that. So it says cocoa grown organically on trees within the shade of the rainforest canopy commands a premium price. So basically we're talking about cocoa that is grown organically within the shade of the rainforest canopy. So this automatically means organically, so you don't need to mention that again. So this commands a premium price. Now the next sentence, however, so be very careful about these words because you change the direction. However, acquiring and maintaining the certification. So now we are talking about the certification that allows the crop to be sold as organically grown. So the certification for organically grown is time consuming, and it's a very labor intensive process. It uses a lot of labor as well. So this is happening. So these are two different things happening. Meanwhile, the price premium for the grower is about 30%. At the same time, for the grower who is growing the organic cocoa, the price premium is going to be 30%. These numbers are important. You need to write down these numbers and be sure that you write the percentage sign with it. Whereas cocoa trees grown in full sun using standard techniques can have twice the yield of organic shade-grown trees. Now remember, these ones are the ones that are shade-grown. And cocoa trees in the sun using standard techniques. Now in this case, initially I thought that they're talking about the grower in terms of these organic ones, but no, they're not using the word organic for the grower. So most probably this is still the one that is using the standard sun-based technique. So the cocoa trees that are grown in full sun using the standard techniques can have twice the yield of the organic trees, the shade-grown trees. Financially, therefore, it says that the standard techniques are better for the farmer. The reason that I understand is that although the price premium is 30%, but the yield, that means the amount of crop that the grower is able to get in a standard setting, is twice that the grower can get in an organic setting. All right, so that is going to be the main evidence. So did you both understand how do we dissect the argument? You need to be very clear about the conclusion and the premises. Do you have any doubt about this argument?
No.
No? Okay, do you think it fits any of those patterns that we have like a plan or cause and effect or a sample or numbers and percentages, anything?
I think numbers and percentages.
Yes. And through my experience, I find that the numbers and percentages one are the ones where students get most confused between two options. So if before looking at the options, if you're not clear on what the argument is actually saying, it can be a really tough thing to do. But in this case, I think it's quite obvious what the conclusion is, especially because the word therefore is being used. So this is a little easier. Let's look at another option. Okay, now what I want you to do is take about a couple of minutes and I want you to tell me what the conclusion is and what kind of evidence or premises are being used to support that conclusion. So you have 2 minutes for that. Okay, let me start with deconstructing this argument. So basically what you should have on your scratch paper is that from 1900 till 1930, we're talking about a disease, let's just call it P. And later it was discovered to result from a deficiency of niacin. So that means it's not just in our minds that this is the cause, it was actually discovered as the cause. So it's fine if we establish this cause and effect relationship. And this was quite common among the poor cotton farmers whose diet mainly consisted of corn. So these are a few important details you should have. And corn was basically the cheapest food, that's why. And corn does not contain usable niacin. That's also important to mention because we never know what kind of options we'll get. Curiously here marks a shift in the tone of the argument. So it shows that all this is happening, but something strange also happened, which is that during the Depression, when price of cotton reduced, and income of these poor cotton farmers reduced. That means they basically became poorer. The pellagra also declined. So what do you think is happening here? What kind of conclusion is the argument presenting?
Because of the depression, they were not able to consume the corn, and anyway, it doesn't have nicel in a usable form, and that was the reason. I mean, the incidence of pellagra went down in them.
Yes. So basically, what the argument is showing you is two different things. It's not giving you a very clear conclusion, either implicitly or explicitly, what it wants you to believe about pellagra and niacin and corn. All that it's talking about is something strange is happening. So this is most probably an argument that goes with a paradox kind of question. I hope you both know what a paradox question is. You might have seen it. Have you both seen those kind of questions?
Yeah, I have seen it.
Yeah. All right, so you basically get a question which says, which of the following resolves the paradox? So Divya, like you said something about they consuming something else apart from corn, that would be like a good answer to resolving the paradox question. Basically something that explains why these two different things are happening. And you don't have to strengthen or weaken anything, but you just have to clear the loophole that is there in it. So let's look at another argument. Okay, this one. So you have a couple of minutes for this one. Okay, so what do you think is the conclusion here? Is there a clear conclusion?
Well, the number of cars on the roads and the ownership has increased, but the total amount of injuries and deaths have not.
So again, I think you realize that now this is also a paradox kind of a question. So can you come up with any kind of example of an answer option that could explain why this is happening?
One I could think of is like maybe the vehicles they are using, they have a safety towards the person who is driving the vehicle, so that's why there is no injury to them. Though the accident is happening, but the person who is driving the car is not getting injured.
Yeah,
Maybe safety is more or something else.
yeah, that's absolutely correct. So if you're able to identify what kind of option you're looking for, it makes it easier to eliminate the wronger options. So that's good. And I think we're almost, we are almost out of time here. So I'm going to end the session here. We didn't do much in critical reasoning, but we are going to do that in the next session. This was more about sentence correction and a bit of introductory strategies towards the whole verbal section as a whole. So I am going to email you the list of questions. I'll email you one complete file that will take care of all sentence correction questions for all future classes as well. And what I want you to do is try solving a few of those sentence correction questions based on subject verb agreement, punctuation, meaning, and concision and structure. And let me know if you have any doubts about any question. And if you want this session to change in any other way, let me know if you want something else to be added or removed. Okay? And